Garfield is the most widely syndicated comic strip in the world and is being printed in well over 2,000 papers and is read by millions of readers every single day. In fact, that's exactly how I discovered Garfield back in the early 90s, the traditional 3-panel comic strip, which was being printed in the Daily Express, and my grandparents allowed me to cut out the comic strip and I would then glue them into my scrapbook, and over time I had created my very own Garfield comic book, and I've been a fan ever since. Jim grew up in a farmhouse, and as a child he was asthmatic and this prevented him from playing outside, so he spent most of his days inside the family farmhouse with a pencil and paper provided to him by his mother, who really wanted to push this passion he had for drawing. And Jim actually did have a passion for drawing, and he would often add words to his early sketches to describe what he had drawn, something that would stick around for many years. And as Jim got older, his talent grew and he found himself studying to become an art teacher, but ultimately he did not feel that this was his true calling. He didn't want to teach art, he wanted to create art. And one thing he had a passion for was drawing comic strips, and he compared this to doing theatre work. And when Jim created a comic strip, he would write the script, set the stage and draw his characters exactly how he wanted them to act out. His paper was his stage. Jim's big break came in 1969 when he was offered a job to work with Tom Ryan, who was the creator of another popular comic strip, Tumbleweeds. Working as Tom's assistant, Jim would be in charge of background art, drawing borders, speech balloons and inking, all great experience that would one day come in handy when creating his very own comic strip. But Jim's first comic strip was not Garfield, it was a character named Norm the Gnat, a humorous comic strip featuring the world of insects, something Jim thought would be a sure thing as it was totally an original idea. The comic strip was published between 1973 and 1975 in one paper only, and it was constantly rejected from other papers, and so after 2 years Jim accepted that Norm the Gnat was never going to be successful, and he ended the comic strip after being told by one editor that no one really relates to bugs. And so Jim went away and went about creating another character. Jim noticed a growing trend with dogs starring in many comic strips such as Snoopy and Marmaduke. And Jim also noticed that he did not see many cats in comic strips, and so he went about creating his own feline character named Garfield. And here's a fun fact, he actually named Garfield after his grandfather. Jim decided that he wanted to stay away from politics that most comic strips incorporated into their panels, making them a product of their time, whereas Garfield was simply portrayed as a fat, cynical cat who hates Mondays and loves food, especially lasagna, and he is often annoyed by John's other pet, Odie the dog, and actually by John himself. And so he created his second comic strip, but it wasn't called Garfield, it was actually called John. Yeah, at first the comic strip was not actually titled Garfield. The John comic strip featured John Arbuckle, an artist, and his cat Garfield, named after Davis's grandfather, and later a character named Lyman, who was John's roommate, and Lyman's dog named Spot, who would later be renamed to Odie. The comic strip named John was originally published in the Pendleton Times newspaper and ran from 1976 to 1978. In 1977, the comic strip was renamed from John to Garfield, and the rest is history. In March of 1978, United Feature Syndicate accepted the strip, which was now titled Garfield, for national distribution. The strip ran in 41 newspapers and it became a massive success. People loved it. In fact, one newspaper, the Chicago Sun-Times, actually dropped Garfield only to receive quite a lot of complaints through the mail from Garfield fans insisting that they bring back Garfield, and realising their mistake, the newspaper did just that. Now, at first Garfield did not look exactly how he does today. It was designed to look somewhat like a real cat that was very overweight with very tiny eyes, and over time Jim found it incredibly hard to actually show emotions on Garfield's face. And also because of the way he had drawn Garfield's body, he found it hard to show Garfield expressing himself through movement. So Jim made the choice in the early 80s to make Garfield into a more slimlined cat, and he now looked more cartoony with bigger expressive eyes. And this is a version of Garfield that we all know and love today. Well, kind of, because as the years went on, Garfield went through other minor changes. The most noticeable was how Jim started to draw Garfield walking on his two hind legs. Jim found that redesigning Garfield this way made it possible for Garfield to kick Odie off a table or to reach up to that table to grab a piece of pie or lasagna. 3 years after Garfield was syndicated, the lasagna-loving cat appeared in nearly 2,600 newspapers, and the character of Lyman became less and less of a regular character in the comic strip, and he made a few appearances in 1983 until disappearing for good, leaving his dog Odie behind. And that was it. No explanation was ever given for Lyman's disappearance in the comics, but other characters were introduced and stuck around until this very day, including Garfield and Odie's vet, Dr. Liz Wilson, who is also a love interest for John, a pink cat named Arlene, who is Garfield's love interest, a grey-striped kitten named Nermal, who always seems to be an irritation to Garfield, and of course Garfield's teddy bear Pookie, who is just a teddy bear but in my opinion is as much a character as everyone else. And as time went on, it wasn't only the comic strip that was putting money into Jim's pocket. Garfield had become a merchandising hit. Over the years there have been Garfield toys, slippers, clothing, house phones, books, posters, video games, VHS tapes, DVDs. In fact, I say the most famous piece of Garfield merchandise in the 80s and 90s was a Garfield plush with the suckers on each paw that you would often see in the windows of most cars. Also over the years, Garfield has been the star of many TV specials and cartoon series and movies. In 1980, Garfield appeared in The Fantastic Funnies, which starred many a popular syndicated comic strip brought to life by the magic of animation, which aired on CBS, and Garfield was brought to life by the voice actor Scott Beach. This was Garfield's first journey into TV, but it most certainly will not be his last. From 1982 to 1991, Garfield starred in 12 cartoon TV specials, and voice actor Lorenzo voiced Garfield in all of them, and quickly became the voice of Garfield. Lorenzo would voice Garfield in all of the TV specials, including Here Comes Garfield, Garfield on the Town, Garfield in the Rough, Garfield Goes to Hollywood, Garfield is 9 Lives, Garfield's Babes and Bullets, Garfield's Thanksgiving, Garfield's Feline Fantasies, and Garfield Gets a Life. And from 1988 to 1994, Garfield got his very own animated TV show called Garfield and Friends, which ran for 7 seasons, with Lorenzo voicing Garfield once again. And I remember absolutely loving this show. It was one of my favourite cartoons at that time, and to see my favourite comic strip come to life on the TV was amazing, and I loved every minute of the series. The cartoon was roughly 20 minutes long and it was split into different segments. The first segment belonged to Garfield as we joined him on a zany adventure. It was no longer the 3-panel comic that I was used to reading, now it was animated in all its glory. Then after the Garfield segment, a different cartoon would come on which was set on a farm, and it featured a large cast of farm animals. This cartoon was called US Acres and was actually another one of Jim Davis's comic strips that was adapted for TV. And then we would get another Garfield story followed by a segment called a Garfield Quickie, which seemed to take one of Garfield's 3-panel comic strips and turn them into a short but sweet animated version of that strip. Now, I must say, when the US Acres segment of the cartoon came on, I wasn't really that interested in it. I wasn't a big fan of this. I watched them, but I was much more invested in the Garfield segments that were, well, more Garfield, and to me as a child were more fun, whilst the US Acres cartoons always seemed to be slightly on the learning side, with a story that held a message for the viewers. And then when we got back to Garfield, it was more of a fun episode. Now, looking back on these cartoons now with my adult eyes, I still do kind of prefer the Garfield episodes, but I must admit the US Acres episodes are not bad at all, and I can appreciate them for what they are.
I can't believe we get away with this every week.
Lorenzo didn't only voice Garfield in the TV specials and the Garfield TV series, he also voiced Garfield in video games and TV commercials throughout the years, as well as many other things. In 2002, Lorenzo sadly passed away at the age of 64, but left behind so many characters that he's voiced over the years. And just like when I read a Batman comic, I hear the voice of Kevin Conroy, who voiced Batman in Batman the Animated TV series for so many years and other projects. When I read a Garfield comic, it is always Lorenzo voice that I hear. There is just no substitute.
Beware of imitations, accept no substitutes, batteries not included.
And did you know that there is a strange kind of connection between Lorenzo and Bill Murray? and the Garfield and Ghostbusters animated TV series. You see, Lorenzo Music voiced both Garfield and Peter Venkman from Ghostbusters the animated TV show, whilst Bill Murray played Peter Venkman in the Ghostbusters movies. And it's rumoured that Bill Murray was not a fan of the voice of Peter Venkman in the animated series, as he did not like sounding like Garfield the cat. And he had Lorenzo Music replaced with Dave Coulier, who then went on to voice Venkman for the remaining seasons. Now fast forward to 2004 and Bill Murray was cast as Garfield in the new live action movie, where Garfield was now a CGI cat, making the circle complete.
I hate Mondays.
Now, the Garfield movie I was not a fan of. For me, it just isn't Garfield. I mean, the movie itself is fine. It's your standard live-action children's movie with a CGI character. I think it's in the same vein as the Smurf movies and the Alvin and the Chipmunk movies. That are perfectly enjoyable films, but for me, it just did not feel like Garfield. Now, one of the main issues I had with the Garfield movie was that Garfield was a CG animated cat, made to look more like Jim Davis's creation, made to look more like Garfield, which was absolutely fine. That was a good thing. But he was also animated to look like a real life cat. And all the other animals in the movies were actually played by real animals, which made it feel a little off. I mean, you could tell that this cat was Garfield, and that was a good thing. But there were little details missing, like the black stripes on his fur, the black stripes on his ears and his tail, which was a real missed opportunity in my opinion. They should have been present on the character. And like I said, despite all this, you could still tell it was Garfield, and the movie was fine. I suppose it was showing Garfield to a new generation who hadn't really experienced the comic book or the cartoon in the past. And like I said, the movie itself was fine. But it just felt like something was missing. Having John played by a real life person and even Odie the dog played by a real dog, it was just too far away from the comic strip for me. Because in my opinion, the character of John and the character of Odie are just as important a character as Garfield himself. But in 2008 we would be treated to a brand new Garfield TV series that was in many ways very much like Garfield and Friends. But this one was fully CGI animation, and at first it did take a while to get used to the style, but there was no denying that this was Garfield from the comic. The characters all resembled the comic strip days. It was good to see Garfield, the Garfield I remembered, back again in a new show. And this show was released to coincide with the comic strip's 30th anniversary, and also welcomed back many of the crew members that worked on Garfield and Friends. And maybe this was why it felt so familiar to me. In 2016, the Garfield show came to an end, but it was only 3 years later that we would get the Garfield originals. These were 2D short animated sketches, each lasting around 30 seconds in total, and they did about 120 of these. And in my opinion, Garfield is best when he is in 2D. I believe that is when he actually looks his best, because that is the closest we will actually get to him being in the comic strip. Now, these Garfield originals are truly bite-sized little episodes, and I had no idea that they existed until I came to make this video. Now, I've watched quite a few of these, and they are silly and they are funny, but they are also kind of annoying. And there are no speaking lines, which I think is absolutely crucial for a Garfield project. Garfield's sarcasm and wit needs to be part of the show. He needs to be vocal. Well, you know what I mean, as far as Garfield can be vocal. But on the other hand, the animation is quite nice, and it restores Garfield and the supporting characters to how they actually looked in the comic strip. These short videos are probably the closest thing to the strip and the Garfield and Friends animated TV series I think we have ever had. And I actually think if they had produced actual episodes that were around 20 minutes long with actual story and dialogue, we would have had a good Garfield show on our hands. But instead we got these throwaway 30-second clips that didn't really leave me wanting more and were quite honestly forgettable. But I guess any Garfield content is good, and even though we have had so many great TV specials, a few TV series and some movies, in my opinion Garfield works best in his original format as a comic strip, and that's where it all started. It's the heart of Garfield, where I believe the character shines, in the brilliant simplicity of the 3-panel comic strip. And even Jim Davis himself has said that's how he would like the legacy of Garfield to be remembered. In Jim's own words, there have been movies, there have been books, there have been other things. I certainly want him to be known as a comic strip because that's where he really entertains. That's where he struts his stuff. That's his sweet spot.